They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes the truest stories are whispered by the defeated, those whose voices echo across generations, crying not for pity, but for remembrance. The story of Biafra is one such echo, carved into the heart of Africa like a scar and a lesson all at once. It was not just a war between brothers or a political struggle for recognition. It was the soul of a people demanding to exist, to breathe, to build, and to be heard in a continent still finding its identity after centuries of foreign chains. The rise and fall of Biafra is not simply an event in Nigeria's past. It is a mirror held up to all of Africa's present and future. It reveals how unity can crumble under greed, how truth can be strangled by silence, and how the courage of a small nation can ignite the conscience of the world, even if only for a moment. In the mid-20th century, when the drums of independence rolled across Africa, nations were being born from the dust of colonization, each seeking to find its rhythm, its destiny, its place in the modern world. But in Nigeria, the promise of independence soon gave way to disillusionment. Ethnic tensions, political manipulation, and the fragile stitching of colonial borders became the fault lines of tragedy. When the Igbo people, proud, industrious, and visionary, declared the Republic of Biafra in 1967, they did so not from rebellion but from desperation, from the ashes of massacres and the haunting realization that their lives and dignity meant little to the powers that ruled them. It was a cry for safety, for justice, for self-determination. It was Africa's first great test of whether freedom truly meant freedom for all. For 30 long months, Biafra stood, bleeding but unbroken, with little weapons, starving citizens, and a world that turned its face away. They fought not merely for land but for the principle that no human should be forced to beg for existence within his own home. In the eyes of Biafra's children, swollen with hunger yet fierce with pride, you could see the entire African struggle condensed into one image: the price of dignity in a world that values power more than people. The fall of Biafra in 1970 was not the end of a rebellion, it was the burial of a dream, the silencing of one of the boldest voices Africa had ever produced. And yet, the spirit of that fallen nation refused to die. It became an invisible flame, a whisper that still follows the wind through every conversation about justice, governance, and African unity. The world's betrayal of Biafra is one of history's darkest silence. Nations that preached democracy turned blind eyes to genocide. Global powers that claimed moral leadership watched as over 2 million lives were lost to famine and war. The international community, tied by interests and oil politics, chose convenience over compassion. But perhaps the deeper betrayal was Africa's own, the failure of her leaders to see in Biafra not a threat but a reflection of their own potential downfall. When Africa stood by and watched her own child starve, she lost more than a nation. She lost a piece of her moral compass. And that is the lesson that should haunt us still, that a continent which fails to protect its own truth will forever remain at the mercy of foreign lies. Yet amidst the ruins of Biafra, there are lessons of endurance, brilliance, and unyielding innovation. During those desperate years, Biafrans engineered their own weapons, refined crude oil without refineries, and even built radios to broadcast hope. They proved that the African mind, when cornered, becomes the most creative force on earth. That is why the Biafran story should never be remembered only through tears but through admiration, for it showed what Africa could achieve when necessity met courage. If such ingenuity could arise from starvation and war, imagine what Africa could build with peace, unity, and vision. Biafra's fall was tragic, but its resilience was prophetic. It spoke of a continent that, though battered, still holds within her veins the ability to reinvent herself. Africa must learn that her borders are not sacred lines drawn by colonial hands, but wounds stitched without healing. Until we understand that true unity cannot come from fear or forced allegiance, we will repeat the mistakes that buried Biafra. The lesson is not that secession is noble or rebellion righteous. It is that justice, inclusion, and equality must form the foundation of every African state. Where there is marginalization, division will always follow. Where there is oppression, resistance will always rise. The real solution for Africa's future is not to silence those who demand fairness, but to listen before the anger becomes fire. Biafra teaches us that identity is power. A people who know who they are cannot be erased by any government or war. Today, the Igbo spirit remains one of Africa's most powerful examples of resilience. From the markets of Onitsha to the boardrooms of global cities, their genius still shines. But the greater truth is that every African, whether from Lagos or Luanda, Kinshasa or Cape Town, carries within them the same flame that once burned in Biafra. A hunger to be free, to be respected, to be whole. That flame must not be forgotten. It must be nurtured into a new kind of revolution, not of weapons, but of wisdom, not of division, but of destiny. Africa's future depends on how we interpret Biafra's past. If we see it as a failed rebellion, we will keep failing. But if we see it as a warning, a vision, and a cry for integrity, then we can begin to build nations that truly belong to their people. The children of Biafra may have been silenced by hunger, but their silence still speaks volumes. It tells us that leadership without empathy is tyranny, that unity without justice is slavery, and that peace without truth is only the pause before another storm. The lesson of Biafra is that Africa must learn to value her people above her politics. Development will mean nothing if our citizens remain unseen, unheard, and unloved in their own land. We cannot claim to honor Pan-Africanism while crushing the dreams of our smaller nations or ethnic groups. Unity must be built on respect, not on domination. True freedom will come the day Africa stops repeating the patterns of her colonizers, the day she stops waging war on herself. The fall of Biafra should have ended with silence, but instead it birthed questions that continue to shape Africa's destiny. What is nationhood if it costs the lives of its children? What is progress if it erases the cultures that make us who we are? What is independence if our people still live under systems that deny them justice? These are not just Nigerian questions, they are African questions, global questions, human questions. And perhaps in the end, the greatest lesson of Biafra is that no idea truly dies when it is rooted in truth. Nations can fall, flags can be lowered, but the spirit that drives a people to seek justice cannot be buried. It becomes part of the wind that moves generations, a whisper that grows into a roar when the time is right. Today, Africa stands again at a crossroads between memory and progress, between fear and courage. The question is not whether Biafra will rise again as a nation, but whether the ideals for which it stood, freedom, equity, and self-determination, will finally rise within Africa's soul. If we dare to learn, if we dare to listen, Biafra's tragedy can become Africa's turning point. The ashes of that dream can fertilize the soil of a new beginning, but only if we remember, only if we choose not to let convenience bury conscience, only if we look upon the past, not as a wound to hide, but as a map to guide us. Biafra fell, yes, but it did not vanish. It lives on in every African who refuses to bow to injustice, who dares to think freely, who believes that Africa's best days are not behind her but still ahead. For the spirit of Biafra, though silenced in body, still speaks, and it calls us all to rise, to rebuild, and to remember that Africa's destiny will be written not by those who forget, but by those who refuse. The endurance of the human spirit is the most powerful force known to mankind, and nowhere in modern African history is this more clearly revealed than in the story of Biafra. It is a story that begins in suffering and loss, but rises beyond pain to speak of an inner strength that cannot be conquered. The Biafrans were surrounded by hunger, bombs, and betrayal, yet they refused to surrender their humanity. Even as the world looked away, they built hope out of ruins, dignity out of despair, and faith in their own survival when every sign around them spoke of death. Their cities were destroyed, their children starved, and their dreams seemed to vanish beneath the dust of war. But within that silence, the unbreakable core of the human spirit glowed brighter than ever. It was a flame that refused to die. The endurance of those people, their courage to continue even when the outcome was certain defeat, is the greatest lesson for all who believe that hope can be destroyed by circumstance. The spirit that carried Biafra was not one of arrogance or rebellion. It was the spirit of life defending itself. When the world turned its back and starvation became a weapon, the people turned their pain into creativity. They made salt from seawater when the borders were blocked. They built makeshift refineries, radios and airplanes with their own hands because necessity had become their teacher. That ingenuity was not born from luxury but from the will to live. They proved that human potential shines brightest in darkness, that courage is not the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear control destiny. The Biafrans taught the world that no matter how small a nation or how desperate a situation, the human mind can always find a way to fight for existence. It is a truth that transcends geography. It belongs to every person who has ever been told they cannot survive and yet does. When you look deeply into the eyes of a starving child from that war, you do not see defeat. You see determination. You see a will that says, I will live even if the world forgets me. That is what endurance truly means: to persist without applause, to stand even when the ground beneath you is crumbling. The people of Biafra did not fight only with guns. They fought with dignity. They sang songs in the dark, carried their elders on their backs through forests, and shared their last handful of food with strangers because kindness to them was still sacred even in the face of death. Such humanity and horror is what separates the human soul from the beast. It is what proves that suffering cannot erase compassion, that even in chaos, love endures. This endurance also speaks to something far greater than war. It speaks to identity. The Biafrans endured not merely because they wanted to live, but because they knew who they were. They were people of heritage, faith, and culture, and that knowledge gave them an inner fortress that no army could destroy. When a people understand their worth, oppression loses its power. The human spirit, once awakened to its own strength, becomes indestructible. That is the gift of suffering. It exposes what cannot be broken. It teaches a people to rise again, not because the world is fair, but because their ancestors survived worse and still passed the torch of life forward. Biafra became the embodiment of that truth, the living proof that Africa's heartbeat cannot be silenced by guns, hunger, or tyranny. And yet endurance is not just about surviving pain, it is about transforming it into me. Many who lived through the war went on to rebuild, to educate, to create. They took their wounds and turned them into wisdom. Their endurance became an inheritance for generations that followed. It taught their children that courage is not found in victory but in persistence. Even those who lost everything held on to their humanity, proving that while empires can fall and nations can vanish, the spirit of a people endures beyond time. In every corner of Africa where injustice still reigns, that same spirit continues to whisper, reminding the oppressed that their story does not end in suffering but begins in survival. To endure is to carry history with grace. It is to remember and still move forward. The endurance of the Biafran people stands as a mirror to all of Africa, showing what happens when dignity becomes the final weapon of the weak. It is easy to give up when the world turns against you. It is easy to hate, to surrender to bitterness, or to forget who you are. But endurance is the art of standing still in the storm, holding on until the light returns. That is the lesson that Biafra left behind for all humanity. That strength is born not from power, wealth, or numbers, but from purpose. When you know what you stand for, no defeat can erase your legacy. The human spirit is like the seed buried in the soil. It may be hidden, trampled, and forgotten, but in time it breaks through the earth and rises toward the sun. Biafra's endurance is that seed planted deep in Africa's heart. Though buried by history, it grows still, reminding us that no people can truly perish when their memory carries the fire of truth. The world may not have seen Biafra's victory, but the victory lies in its survival, in the fact that decades later we still speak of their courage, their creativity, their will to exist. That is the kind of triumph that outlives empires. It is the quiet victory of the human spirit over despair. In every generation there are people who will face their own version of Biafra. They will encounter injustice, loss, or betrayal that seeks to crush their will. But the story remains the same. Endurance is the bridge between suffering and resurrection. It is the invisible strength that turns victims into visionaries. When you endure, you become a living witness that no hardship can define your destiny. The Biafrans did not only survive, they became symbols for all who choose to rise rather than surrender. So let the lesson be clear: endurance is not weakness. It is power restrained, courage sustained, and purpose purified by pain. It is what keeps the human race moving forward when history tries to chain it to despair. The endurance of the human spirit, as shown by Biafra, tells us that the greatest victories are not always seen on battlefields. They are written in the hearts of those who refuse to break. And though nations may fall, though dreams may fade, The human spirit will always rise again, carrying with it the eternal truth that strength is not born from power but from purpose. Unity built on justice, not fear, is the foundation upon which every lasting nation must stand. When Biafra rose, it did so because unity in Nigeria had already begun to rot from within. It was a unity built on forced allegiance, not on shared understanding. It was unity in name, not in truth. Across Africa, the colonial boundaries that had carved tribes into nations became chains that bound people together without healing their wounds. Governments demanded loyalty, but offered no fairness, preached peace while sowing inequality, and expected unity from people whose voices were never heard. And when that silence became unbearable, the fire of rebellion lit up the sky. The lesson is timeless. A people cannot be truly united when justice is absent. When fear replaces fairness, what you have is not unity. It is captivity dressed as order. In the years that followed Nigeria's independence, the dream of one nation began to fracture under the weight of injustice. Ethnic favoritism, political exclusion, and targeted violence made the promise of unity hollow. To be Igbo, to be different, became a mark of suspicion rather than pride. The people who had contributed immensely to the growth of the nation found themselves alienated and unsafe. Their markets were burned, their families slaughtered, and their homeland turned into a battlefield long before war was declared. Yet even then, the cry of the Biafrans was not for domination, it was for fairness, for the right to live with dignity in the country they helped to build. When that cry was ignored, when dialogue turned to bloodshed, the illusion of national unity crumbled, revealing what happens when a nation values power more than its people. True unity must be built on the solid rock of justice, not on the shifting sands of coercion. Africa has learned again and again that unity imposed by the gun never lasts. From Rwanda to Sudan, from the Congo to Ethiopia, the same story repeats itself when a government fears its people, when it silences the small tribes, when it refuses to share power equitably. It is not building a nation but preparing a grave. Unity without justice is slavery under a new name. It demands obedience but denies compassion. It holds the people together not through love but through fear of punishment. And fear by its nature is temporary. The moment courage returns to the oppressed, fear collapses like dust in the wind. Africa's future depends on her ability to rewrite the meaning of unity. It is not about sameness. It is about respect for difference. It is not about dominance. It is about inclusion. A truly united Africa must allow every tribe, every culture, every language to breathe freely without feeling suffocated by another's shadow. This is what Biafra's story teaches us. The failure of justice there was not a local tragedy, it was a continental lesson. It showed how quickly hope can die when leaders stop listening, how quickly love for one's country can turn into sorrow when identity is denied. If unity is to survive in Africa, it must be built from the ground up through truth, through reconciliation, and through the fair treatment of all people, no matter their tribe or tongue. The tragedy of Biafra revealed something deeper about Africa's struggle. The illusion of independence. Many nations gained flags and anthems but not freedom of the spirit. They inherited borders but not brotherhood. The same tools that divided them under colonialism continued to divide them afterward, this time under the guise of nationalism. The ghosts of colonial masters were replaced by local elites who ruled not with justice but with fear. They built governments on mistrust, not cooperation, and so the same cycle of oppression that birthed Biafra continued elsewhere, in new forms and new names. Until Africa learns to lead with justice instead of domination, the wounds will never close. Justice is not a luxury, it is the breath that keeps a nation alive. Without it, every promise of progress becomes hollow, every constitution meaningless, every anthem a song of hypocrisy. The greatness of a nation is not measured by how much power its rulers hold, but by how fairly that power is shared among its people. A government that crushes one tribe to please another plants the seeds of its own destruction. A continent that ignores the cries of its minorities cannot call itself free. The peace that comes from silence is the peace of the graveyard, but the peace that comes from justice is eternal. It is the kind of peace that builds, heals, and restores. Unity built on justice transforms nations from within. It turns suspicion into cooperation, fear into trust, and division into strength. When every citizen feels seen, when every voice matters, then borders no longer divide, they unite. The dream of Africa's unity will remain a mirage until fairness becomes our foundation. The lesson of Biafra calls out to every leader, every policymaker, every teacher: listen before it is too late. The unity of Africa cannot be achieved through speeches or slogans. It must be lived daily through acts of fairness. Only when we treat one another with equity can we begin to rebuild the continent that colonization fractured. The memory of Biafra reminds us that ignoring injustice today means inviting disaster tomorrow. The same divisions that tore Nigeria apart are mirrored across Africa. The solution is not suppression but understanding. Nations must learn to speak honestly with themselves, to confront history, to acknowledge wrongs, and to seek reconciliation, not as a sign of weakness but of wisdom. Justice is not revenge, it is balance, the restoration of dignity, the recognition of shared humanity. The moment Africa begins to value justice more than political gain, unity will follow naturally, because justice is the language that all hearts understand. Let us imagine what Africa could become if her unity were rooted in fairness. Picture a continent where no child feels unsafe because of their tribe, where no group feels invisible within their own homeland, where leadership serves rather than rules. Picture governments that heal wounds instead of deepening them, that share wealth instead of hoarding it, that empower the poor instead of exploiting them. That Africa is possible, but only if we have the courage to learn from Biafra. Fear may force submission, but only justice commands loyalty. Fear may silence rebellion, but only fairness inspires peace. The rise and fall of Biafra is more than a page in history, it is a warning and a vision. It warns of what happens when unity becomes a mask for oppression, and it envisions what Africa could be if we chose a different path. Unity built on justice is stronger than any army because it binds people together through love, not force. It allows nations to grow from diversity, to celebrate their differences rather than fear them. In every African heart that longs for peace, Biafra's story still beats as a reminder we must not mistake control for unity or silence for harmony. A nation held together by fear is already falling apart from within, but a nation held together by justice will never fall, for it stands upon truth, and truth, like light, can never be defeated. Turning tragedy into vision is the hardest task any generation can face. Yet it is the most necessary. The story of Biafra is not a tombstone, it is a mirror held up to the conscience of an entire continent. It is not merely a record of loss, but a lesson carved into the memory of every African heart. The cries of those who perished in that struggle were not in vain. They still echo through time, calling us to see beyond defeat and to transform pain into purpose. What the world saw as failure was, in truth, a revelation. It revealed the cost of injustice, the danger of silence, and the unyielding power of identity. Biafra was not just a rebellion, it was a declaration that dignity is non-negotiable. It was Africa's reminder to herself that no people, no matter how battered, will ever accept chains when freedom is within sight. Yet history teaches us that pain unlearned becomes pain repeated. The tragedy of Biafra cannot simply be remembered. It must be reinterpreted as a seed of rebirth. The ashes of that war still carry the potential for wisdom, if only we dare to look within them. The blood that was spilled must not only remind us of what was lost, but of what can still be gained. The courage to build a fairer Africa where no tribe feels abandoned and no voice feels silenced. That is how tragedy becomes vision, by using grief as fuel, not as a chain. The tears of yesterday must water the soil of tomorrow. If we only mourn Biafra, then the story ends in sorrow. But if we learn from it, if we rise from it, then its meaning transforms into a torch that lights Africa's path forward. The generation that comes after Biafra must refuse to inherit defeat. They must look at the scars of their ancestors, not as symbols of weakness, but as marks of resilience. A scar is proof that healing happened. And if a wound as deep as Biafra's could begin to heal, then so can the rest of Africa's divisions. But healing demands honesty. It demands that nations confront their truth. no matter how uncomfortable. It means acknowledging the pain of those who were silenced and giving voice to those who were ignored. The true legacy of Biafra will not be found in books or speeches, but in the courage of Africa's youth to say we will not repeat the mistakes of the past. We will build nations where leadership means service, where power means responsibility, and where unity means inclusion. Africa cannot afford to bury her lessons under pride. Every conflict, every war, every injustice is a message written in blood, asking the next generation to choose differently. To turn tragedy into vision means to take what once broke us and use it to strengthen our resolve. It means transforming sorrow into structure, into schools, into communities, into ideas that protect life rather than destroy it. The Biafran dream was not merely to separate, it was to survive with dignity, to live in truth, to be free from oppression. That same spirit, if reimagined today, could rebuild nations from within. It could inspire education over ignorance, cooperation over corruption, and compassion over conquest. The future of Africa lies not in what we lost, but in what we can still build from loss. Imagine an Africa where leaders listen to history instead of erasing it. Imagine young minds studying not just the facts of Biafra, but its meaning, the courage to demand justice, the endurance to survive hardship, the wisdom to forgive yet never forget. Imagine nations that measure success not by their borders, but by how well they protect their people's humanity. That is the Africa Biafra dreamed of, and though the dream was buried under rubble and ruin, it still breathes within the conscience of those who remember. To turn tragedy into vision is to understand that every fall is an invitation to rise higher. Africa's story has been one of countless rises and falls, from empires to kingdoms, from independence to internal wars, but the thread that connects them all is resilience. The continent's strength has never been in its leaders, its armies, or its resources. It has always been in its people's spirit. That spirit, once awakened, is unstoppable. It is the same spirit that carried enslaved Africans across oceans without breaking, that led liberation movements through decades of struggle, that refuses even now to be silenced. The lesson of Biafra is that spirit without justice breeds rebellion, but spirit guided by wisdom breeds renewal. Pain alone cannot build a future, but pain understood can. The memory of Biafra teaches us that no progress can stand on inequality. When one group suffers, the whole nation weakens. When leaders exploit divisions, they destroy the foundation of trust. The transformation of tragedy into vision requires empathy, leaders who can feel the pulse of their people and see the humanity in every tribe. It requires citizens who understand that their neighbor's freedom is tied to their own. It requires a collective awakening, a decision to build societies that thrive not by erasing differences, but by celebrating them. That is how a tragedy turns into a rebirth, how suffering transforms into strength. And so the spirit of Biafra lives on, not as a call to divide, but as a call to evolve. It lives in the dream of a continent that finally learns to value people more than politics, humanity more than pride, fairness more than force. It challenges every African youth to look at the continent not as a broken inheritance, but as an unfinished promise. The vision that grows from tragedy is not a dream of escape, it is a dream of redemption, a belief that the bloodshed of the past can give birth to the justice of tomorrow. If the pain of Biafra can teach one generation to lead differently, to govern wisely, to love fearlessly, then no life lost was ever wasted. The true victory is not in revenge, but in renewal. The greatest memorial to Biafra is not a monument of stone, but a continent that learned its lesson. The cries of the past must become the conscience of the present. Africa must rise not from denial, but from understanding. Each nation must look at its reflection and ask, what are we building, and for whom? Are we creating unity or just pretending it? Are we healing wounds or deepening them? When justice becomes the heartbeat of governance, when equality becomes the measure of success, when compassion replaces corruption, then and only then will Africa fulfill the vision that Biafra began. The story of Biafra will forever haunt and inspire the African soul, but it is up to this generation to decide what that story becomes. Will it remain a symbol of loss, or will it transform into the foundation of rebirth? The answer lies in our hands, in our choices, in our courage to learn from the ashes. Tragedy alone changes nothing. Only transformation does. Let the fire that once burned cities now ignite minds. Let the sorrow that once broke hearts now build bridges. Let the memory of Biafra remind us that the greatest nations are not those that never fall, but those that rise again with wisdom, compassion, and justice as their new crown. That is how Africa turns tragedy into vision, by remembering that every wound, when healed with truth, becomes a map toward the future.